Hey everyone, this is our Sunday Bible study for January 31st, 2021. We are continuing our study in the Foundations material from the Gospel Advocate. This quarter is going through the book of Genesis. This is Genesis part 2. Last quarter we also spent in the book of Genesis. And this morning we're ready for lesson 9. As we look at lesson 9, we're looking at Pharaoh's promotion of Joseph. In Genesis chapter 41, verses 37 through 57. And so if you want to follow along, Genesis 41, 37 through 57. And so we're looking at a lot that has taken place since the last time we were together. Last lesson, we noticed it ended with Joseph being thrown into prison. And in the last few verses, we see him rising in prominence in the prison to where the keeper of the prison, as long as Joseph was handling it, he didn't even have anything to do with it. And we've seen this trend with Joseph. God is obviously with him. God is blessing him. And so he's risen to that position of prominence, but he's still in prison. And so as we now are looking at a lesson entitled Pharaoh Promotes Joseph, it makes you wonder, okay, what all's taken place? Well, the introduction in the book does a good job of trying to catch us up to where we need to be. We're on page 94 in the classroom book if you have one of them. The author says a delicate balance exists between divine sovereignty and human freedom. Although God is in control and rules in the kingdom of men, he does not force man's actions. This goes back to the doctrine of free will. It's something that we see throughout the Bible. God has always and will always give man the choice. He wants man to choose to serve him. He will not force man to do so. He will not make man do so. He will allow mankind that choice. We see that all the way beginning in the Garden of Eden. God had given them things that they were to do and things that they were not to do. And they had the choice to choose to obey that or to reject that. And we see that once again here as we talk about this idea of God being the one who is sovereign and who rules over all. He still allows us the choice. And he says he does not force man's actions. Instead, he allows man to act freely and use man's actions, whether good or evil, to accomplish his will. For example, Joseph's brothers acted freely when they sold him into slavery. Definitely something wrong that they did there. Nevertheless, they unwittingly sent Joseph to the place he needed to be in order to help his family survive and ultimately develop into a nation. This was no accident. God was at work behind the scenes. Thus, when Joseph later spoke with his brothers about what had transpired, he declared, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." Genesis 50:20. You know, we talked last week a little bit about providence. I was about to say prominence. Providence. We talked about God's providence and how it's God working through natural means to bring about his will. And this chapter, or this paragraph right here, is excellent in explaining really what we're talking about when we're talking about providence. He doesn't force man's actions. Instead, he allows man to act freely and then uses man's actions, whether good or evil, to accomplish his will. And then, of course, he uses the example there of Joseph being sold into slavery. And, of course, Genesis 50:20 is a text that's used many times when we talk about providence. He says, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." In other words, God used it to bring about his purpose, and to bring about something good. Looking back on Joseph's life, we see additional moments when God utilized the free choice of others to bring about his desired result. For instance, the false accusation made by Potiphar's wife against Joseph proved beneficial, for because of that charge, he was placed in the prison where the king's prisoners were confined. You know, as obviously, as you're looking at it when Joseph is in the middle of this, you definitely don't see God's hand involved. Here it says it was beneficial that Potiphar's wife accused him of rape. Well, I'm sure Joseph didn't feel that it was beneficial at the time. And that's the thing about providence. It's kind of only something that's easily seen in hindsight. As we look at Joseph's life in hindsight, we see God's hand there. But it's something that when you're in the middle of it, you don't always see it. I mean, some of the bad things that have happened to us, to you, to me, to others, as we look at that, it's probably not something, especially while we're in the middle of it, where we think of that as something that's beneficial. But maybe later on, God uses that to bring about a desired result, to bring about something good. And then looking back on that, we can see, while that wasn't pleasant, it had a purpose. And so here with Joseph, we're seeing that these things that are happening to him, while they're not pleasant, while God is not causing them to happen, God is using them for a purpose. In that setting, talking about him being in prison, Joseph encountered two of Pharaoh's officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. When those men had troubling dreams, Joseph provided an interpretation for each. And we're looking at things, just by way of statement, we're looking at things in chapter 39, chapter 40, as we move towards here, chapter 41. And so if you want to go back and read those chapters, if you haven't read them in a while, it wouldn't be a bad idea, because it gives you the backstory of how Joseph is continuing to move towards where we're going to be looking at today. So the men had troubling dreams. Joseph provided the interpretation for each. Speaking to the chief butler, he declared, "Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me, make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house." And so we see here Joseph provides this interpretation, and it says to him, make sure to remember me. When these things take place, make sure to remember me. Don't forget about me, and tell Pharaoh to get me out of here. Let him know I did something good for you, and so please get Pharaoh to get me out of here. It's something that's interesting, just as a side note. The other man who had the troubling dream, it's kind of comical as you read it. The Bible says that once he had seen that Joseph had given a good interpretation, he goes to Joseph with his dream. In other words, he was kind of sitting back and waiting, not knowing, which he didn't realize that Joseph served Almighty God. He didn't realize that God was giving him the interpretation, so it was going to be true. He was seeing if Joseph was the type of interpreter that gave bad interpretations or good. And when he saw it was good, he went to him with his dream. Unfortunately, his dream was going to end in his death. And that is actually how it all worked out. As Joseph predicted, the chief butler was restored to his position. Even so, he did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. This is yet another injustice Joseph endured. 2 years later, however, the butler remembered Joseph when Pharaoh had 2 dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them. Telling Pharaoh about Joseph, he recalled, "Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams. To each man he interpreted according to his dreams, and it came to pass just as he had interpreted for us, so it happened." And so now Pharaoh's had a dream, in fact 2 dreams, in which the 2 dreams are telling Pharaoh the same thing, but no one could interpret the dreams. And that's when he remembered, oh, Joseph, I forgot about him. And so he remembers Joseph. He tells Pharaoh about Joseph. And so Pharaoh sent, he called Joseph. He brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. After Pharaoh explained to Joseph that he summoned him to interpret his dreams, Joseph humbly replied, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." This is kind of, I say reminiscent. It's actually happening before. But when you come to the book of Daniel, remember Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Well, God interpreted, but Daniel was the instrument. Daniel had the same attitude that Joseph had here. An attitude of, it's not me that's doing the interpreting, it's God. And so we see Joseph seeking to make sure that God is the focal point. Great lesson for us. After Pharaoh explained to Joseph, he had summoned him for the dream. Joseph told him God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. God, of course, did so through the agency of Joseph. Joseph skillfully relayed the meaning of Pharaoh's two dreams and the way they pointed to a future famine that would follow 7 years of plentiful harvest. If you recall the dream said that there would be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. And so God's letting Pharaoh know what's going to take place. And he then advised, now therefore Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh. And let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. And so Joseph says, here's what's going to happen, Pharaoh, and here's what you need to do in order to prepare for that. Joseph, I don't think there was any idea in Joseph's mind of what Pharaoh was about to do next. I don't think that's why Joseph said this. I think Joseph is just genuinely trying to give Pharaoh a guidebook or a plan in order to navigate these next 14 years, the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine. Consequently, Pharaoh promoted Joseph to oversee the efforts to prepare for the famine. And so that brings us to where we want to pick up in the text this morning. We are in Genesis, once again, chapter 41, verses 37 through 57 is what we're looking at together. Beginning in verse 37, so the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. While Joseph might not have been interviewing for the position or seeking to have some position of prominence, the advice that he gave Pharaoh said, hey, this is good advice. This is something that is helpful. This is something that we can use. And so to Pharaoh, the choice was obvious. Joseph was the one who needed to be promoted to this position to handle all of this. In verse 38, and Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? On page 97 in the book, the author writes, concerning this question, Hamilton wrote, Pharaoh suggests that it is most unlikely. And should a nationwide search for a viable candidate for this ad hoc position be launched, then a more qualified occupant for that office than Joseph could be found. It demonstrates that Pharaoh, via his rhetorical declaration, understood Joseph's skills. Joseph had no intrinsic ability that would explain his effective insight and counsel. For Pharaoh, Joseph is one who has been divinely equipped and gifted. And so Pharaoh, whether he believed in the God of Joseph at this point, he does believe that Joseph has been given the skills and the insight, that are needed in order to enact this plan and in order to make sure that Egypt is prepared for the coming famine. Verse 39, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. The author of our book says, with these words, Joseph was officially released from prison and made second in command in all of Egypt. To emphasize the power he was given to Joseph, we see verse 41. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. I mean, think about this for a moment. You can't help but know that God's the one in control. I mean, this was a young man who had been sold into slavery. He was a slave. And now, we'll see this later on, 13 years, that's what it is, have passed. In 13 years, he's gone from a slave to second in command in Egypt, okay? Egypt, the most powerful nation in all the world at this time. And so he's gone to the second most powerful person in the world. I realize God's ultimately the one in control, but from a human standpoint, he is the second most, 13 years, slave to second most powerful man in all of the world. Friends, that doesn't happen without God's hand at work. God has been with Joseph through it all, and Joseph has been faithful to God through it all. In verse 42, then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. All of this signifying that Joseph is accepted by Pharaoh and that he is the one that is going to have authority and people were to follow him. Verse 43, and he made him ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. So Joseph is being shown to everyone to be in this position of authority. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his head or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him a wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. In our book, the author says, according to Kisling, these tokens given in public would ensure obedience to Joseph as he managed the complex task of saving and storing 20% of the crops of Egypt for a predicted, though as yet unrealized famine. You think about it for a moment. People might be a little apprehensive to follow Joseph. First of all, Joseph is an Egyptian. Second of all, he's saying that in 7 years there's going to be a famine. Who cares? 7 years from now. And people would probably think, well, maybe that's not even going to happen. And so they might not want to give over. I mean, you're talking about 20% of your crop that you're supposed to just hand over. And so all of these things are being done to show that Joseph had the authority to do this. Besides providing Joseph with physical tokens of his authority, Pharaoh also gave Joseph an Egyptian name, Zaphnath-Paneah, and an Egyptian wife. All these things were done to make Joseph more acceptable to the Egyptian people that he would govern. And so Joseph has now been promoted, and we're going to see Joseph's plan now being put into action. He has a plan for the land, for the years of plenty. He has a plan for the years of the famine. And so we pick up here in verse 46. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. This is where we get that 13 years have elapsed now since his brothers sold him into slavery. And now he's in this great position of authority. And so we see him going throughout all the land of Egypt. He's surveying the land. He's checking things out. He's talking to the people to make sure that they understand what's going on and why this needs to happen. Now, verse 47, in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. Well, that's what the dream had shown. During these 7 years, there's going to be an abundance, even more than what would be needed. Verse 48, so he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. The author of the book says, praising the practicality of Joseph's efforts, Steinman wrote, the description of Joseph's execution of his plan to provide for the coming famine years, notes that he stored the grain in the nearby cities. Placing the granaries in the centers of population made the most sense and demonstrated Joseph's character as wise and discerning. There would be a ready source of personnel to service the granaries, and yet distribution would not be a problem since the stores in each city could provide for the immediately adjacent countryside. And so Joseph's using, no doubt, the skills that he developed while in Potiphar's house to now help him in managing something much larger than Potiphar's house. In verse 49, Joseph gathered very much grain, as the sand of the sea, until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. And so lots of grains being stored up, and that's important. It's going to be needed. Verse 50, and to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, who Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh. And we get an explanation of what the name means. For God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim. For God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. The author mentions an observation by Guy and Woods, which I thought was really a great observation. Woods observed, as in the matter of the interpretation, so also in his rise to honor and power, Joseph sees the hands of God. Thus he gives his sons names which recall God's activity. And so through all of this, Joseph has realized God's the one in control. God's the one behind the scenes. God's the one pulling the strings. And God is the one that I serve. God is the one that I am faithful to. Joseph never forgot that. And he always followed the God of heaven. That brings us to verse 53. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended. And the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph has said. The famine was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And so we see this famine. This famine isn't just a famine in Egypt. This is a famine everywhere. And of course, not everywhere had the insight that Pharaoh had been given by the dreams. Not everyone had Joseph there to interpret the dreams. Not everyone had the preparations made that Joseph had made for the land of Egypt. And so as the dreams are fulfilled just as we expect them to be, the 7 years of plenty, those come to an end, and now the 7 years of famine begin to march in. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do." On page 100 of the book, the author says, if anything, this shows the confidence Pharaoh placed in Joseph. Joseph collected grain during the years of plenty. Joseph distributed grain during the years of famine. Joseph is the one in control here. He is the one who took it in. He's the one who's now dishing it out. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptian. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all lands. Now that final verse is setting up what's about to take place. The famine's this way in all lands. It's this way where Jacob is. And of course, this is what's going to set up the eventual reunion of Joseph with his family. The author of the book says Joseph did not likely realize his efforts to save Egypt from the famine would also save many others, including his own family. That, however, is exactly what eventually occurred. God remained in control. Joseph freely obeyed God, and the descendants of Jacob, who previously treated Joseph with contempt, were saved because of his faithfulness. Ross wrote, Joseph knew God's revelation, boldly declared it to Pharaoh, and advised him to conform to what God was about to do. It must also be added that once Joseph was elevated to his position of responsibility, he continued to live in faith. You know, you can't help but think about the Pharaoh that was in power when we moved to the book of Exodus. And of course, he didn't conform to what God wanted to do. We see the disastrous results of that. Well, here we have a Pharaoh, though, that did conform to what God was going to do. And as a result, he's blessed by so doing. That brings us to the two applications as we close out our lesson today. He says, Pharaoh knew Joseph was the right person to lead Egypt's efforts to prepare for the coming famine. He could see the Spirit of God at work in him. Although our circumstances are vastly different, we should strive to live so that others see Christ in our actions. If anything, our words and deeds should point others to God. Jesus charged, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Joseph's efforts to prepare Egypt for the famine remind us of the need to obey God. This is the second observation. Although God revealed to Pharaoh what would take place in Egypt, the knowledge alone would have not saved the Egyptians from starvation. Without taking the necessary steps and storing the surplus of grain in the years of abundance, there would have been nothing to eat during the lean years. We must be doers of God's word, James 1:22. And so illustrating for us that it's not enough just to hear what God has to say, but we need to act on what we hear. That brings us to the end of this lesson this morning. And next week we will be in lesson 10, entitled Joseph and His Brothers, taken from Genesis chapter 45, verses 1 through 24. I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to spend some time with us as we study God's Word. And remember, friends, stay healthy, stay hopeful, stay holy. And I hope that you have a great day.